All right, so violence taking place at Kwekwe, which is the 7th largest city in Zimbabwe, and it's found in the middle, literally, of the country. Well, for more on this report, we're now joined by Robert Shivambu, who's the media manager at Amnesty International, and he joins us via Zoom. Thanks very much indeed for joining us, and welcome to the program.
Thanks, Peter, and good evening to your viewers.
All right. When people talk about political violence in Zimbabwe, there are still some with a good memory of 2008 in the lead up and particularly in the post era of the elections. Are we seeing similar patterns of political intolerance and violence in the country?
Yes, so we are seeing some worrying signs, and they all remind us of what we have seen in Zimbabwe in the past during election times. Premeditated violence against supporters of opposition. Just to take you back to what we have seen this year. On the 27th of February, we saw violence in Kwekwe, where the opposition Citizens Coalition for Change has been campaigning, Nelson Chamisa, and we saw machete wielding gangs who were carrying bottles, machetes and other objects attacking members of the opposition in that particular rally. As a result of that, one person was killed, and we saw dozens others being injured. In another incident, we saw last week, we saw police attacking Godfrey Karembera, who is a supporter of the same political party, which is CCC, or Citizens Coalition for Change. They claim that he was using abusive language against them in Harare and justifying the assault that we saw against him. In another incident, ZANU-PF militiamen attacked a woman in Umzingwani after they insisted that she must basically withdraw a candidature ahead of the upcoming by-elections in the country. So these are some of the violent attacks that we have seen meted out against the opposition in the past few weeks and the past months. And this is not good because we're going to the by-elections. So these incidents remind us of the violent history of elections in Zimbabwe. And as Amnesty International, we have been calling for authorities to investigate these attacks on the opposition and make sure that perpetrators are held to account. I mean, police make an argument that Godfrey Karembera last week used abusive language against them. So instead of just assaulting him, why didn't they just charge him or make sure that he's brought to court in fair trial instead of assaulting him? So the state does not become a criminal because it saw someone else committing a crime. So we are saying to the authorities in Zimbabwe to make sure that there's a proper, impartial, as well as investigation into the acts of violence that we have seen against opposition in the country.
How likely is this? I mean, when you are describing the incidents, what sounds clearly is that the ruling party, the police, and the political heads are either working in unison or are both all on the same agenda, even if it's separately. Because we heard the Vice President talk about crushing the opposition like lice, and this is the second most senior figure in the country. With language like that, clearly a lot of people may take that as a call to arms and a call to a certain type of behavior. Police have been notorious for years with this kind of behavior. I think about 3 weeks ago, there were videos of police making young people crawl on the ground outside a police station. And one that was very grainy, we couldn't quite see, of them perhaps beating people inside a police station. So who's going to do the investigating, Mr. Shivambu?
Yeah, in fact, that's what worries us, what we are describing, Peter, because Part of what worries Amnesty International about Zimbabwe is that you never see political authorities condemning violence in the country. You've just cited the example of the Vice President, Constantino Chiwenga, basically using language like the ZANU-PF is going to crush the opposition like lice. So that kind of language doesn't help the situation in a politically charged environment like Zimbabwe. It can only incite violence. And this is why we are calling on authorities to come out strongly against the violence that we are seeing against opposition in the country. And I mean, authorities must know that the language that they use is quite important, and it could have serious implications in the context of the elections, because we have seen violence in the past. And all these attacks that you are citing as examples of what we have seen in the past, it worries us, and we are asking authorities in Zimbabwe to refrain from using such language and come out clearly and condemn violence where it happens. Because if they keep quiet, it means that they are beneficiaries of this violence.
So, 1st of August 2018, the police, the army were deployed, and they shot people in full view of the world. Cameras were rolling, and people were running away, and they were shot in the back. The Motlanthe report investigated, came up with conclusions, but to date, nobody has been brought to account. So perhaps it tells us that these acts will never ever see justice. They may be acknowledged when the evidence is overwhelming, but nobody seems to ever be brought to book. How does that culture change? Will it take intervention from SADC maybe, or the AU? What will happen? Because clearly inside the country it's not going to happen.
Absolutely. In fact, going back to that incident of 2018, following the elections, those people who were shot by the soldiers were simply asking for the Electoral Commission of Zimbabwe to release election results, because they were frustrated with the time it was taking to release the results. So those people were not criminals. And the response of the soldiers, killing of people, and we have not seen anyone being held accountable. Those soldiers who shot those protesters are known in Zimbabwe. Everybody knows them. In fact, we heard that some of them were promoted after they did that to those protesters. So all these examples that we are citing, Peter, they point to a well-orchestrated violence or state violence against the people of Zimbabwe, who are basically asking for their human rights to be respected. I mean, after voting, those people who were shot were basically saying that, show us the results of our votes. But instead, the state responded with fire. So I think you are right. It's time SADC does something about this situation. But as we have seen in the past, we are not seeing any kind of action coming from SADC. So the AU will have to also intervene and make sure that they can begin to make sure that they demand accountability for the killings of people in Zimbabwe who are basically demanding that their human rights are respected. Those people are not criminals. So that's why we are saying as Amnesty International that we would like to see a situation where the state begins to respect the human rights of its people.
With the amount of political intolerance that you're reporting on, with these by-elections that are going to happen on the 26th, are you fearful that things will escalate even further when the stakes are so much higher in 2023?
Yeah, there are those. We have those worries. We have those worries because, as you might have seen, there has been even denial of freedom of assembly and association of certain political parties. Police basically saying that you cannot go, certain political parties cannot go and assemble in a particular area or constituency because there's no manpower. We have seen the opposition last week denied from assembling in certain constituencies because they were told that there was no manpower by the police. So these kind of things are are encouraging some kind of frustrations on the ground. So we are quite fearful that this could result in violence. And this is why we are calling on authorities in Zimbabwe to avoid frustrating voters or people on the ground, because this kind of things could have negative consequences for the elections for the by-elections next week.
We've been talking by and large about incidents that happened to the Citizens Coalition for Change. Have other opposition parties been targeted?
Yeah, there are signs that there are certain political parties that are being targeted, but funny enough, it's that you're asking questions. There are certain political parties, like the MDC has been campaigning in the country freely. We have not seen any kind of violence against them. So it looks like there is some kind of well orchestrated violence against the Triple C, and would call on authorities in Zimbabwe to make sure that this kind of violence is investigated, and that those perpetrators are basically brought to book in courts that meet fair trial standards. It can't be that certain political parties are free to assemble and campaign wherever they want, and other parties are not allowed to assemble. So it's about making sure that there's a level playing field for all political parties in Zimbabwe to exercise their freedom of assembly and association without any kind of discrimination which seems to be sponsored by the state.
We've seen violence against journalists, independent journalists in the past. Is this something that's also been playing out in the lead up to these elections, maybe harassment, arrests even?
Well, I think in a context, or in a political context in Zimbabwe, I think a lot of journalists are operating with a lot of fear, and they are quite careful in terms of how they report on events, because in the past we have seen journalists being targeted for simply doing their work, for simply exposing violations, human rights violations on the ground. Some journalists have been taken to jail on charges that don't even exist in the country, because they have seemed to have reported about things that the state doesn't want to see. And so that's one of our fears, because we might not get a full picture of what's happening in the country, because journalists sometimes are fearful to expose certain things because they feel that there might be consequences for their actions. So yeah, so it's one of the things that worries us as well.
It's quite hard to think of how this can change, because this culture seems to go back. I remember an interview that Robert Mugabe did soon before the government, the merging of ZANU-PF and ZAPU, and he almost talked about opposition parties being an inconvenience or something that was undesirable. So has this been a culture that's been prevalent in Zimbabwe, where opposition parties just have not been tolerated all that much, and that what we're seeing really is not new, but rather a pattern that's played itself out time and time again?
Absolutely. I mean, we can give you a lot of evidence in terms of the brutalizing or demonizing of opposition in Zimbabwe. The late former Prime Minister Morgan Tsvangirai was beaten many times by the police, was beaten by non-state actors in well-orchestrated violence against the opposition in the country. I mean, people who have been coming out exposing what has been happening in Zimbabwe have been targeted. People like Ivan Mawarire were disowned by Robert Mugabe a few years ago when he came out and denounced corruption and violence against the people of Zimbabwe. Robert Mugabe saying that Ivan Mawarire is not one of our own. So you've got the government that is not prepared to tolerate any kind of dissent. And this is why we are seeing this cycle of violence happening in the country. So this is why we say that this culture of violence and demonizing of opposition must end, because it does not help Zimbabwe going forward. The country will just be in a perpetual state of violence, which is not good for the country, because it's also limiting for the country in terms of growth. Who wants to invest in a country where they feel that, there's no rule of law? So this is why we are calling for the government of Zimbabwe to make sure that they respect human rights, they respect the rule of law, and they respect personal liberties.
Yeah. Perhaps as a final question, the president has on a number of occasions stood up in public and said we must not have violence, we must have free and fair elections, people must not be intimidated. So the question is, how come it's still carrying on if the most powerful man in the country is saying in public, don't do it?
Well, if Mr. Mnangagwa means what he says, he must make sure that state agencies or organs that are responsible for ensuring that there are checks and balances in terms of conducting elections, in terms of maintaining the rule of law, he must make sure that they are doing their work without any kind of interference. He must make sure that they can be held accountable if something goes wrong, if he means what he says. And as you were just citing at the beginning of this conversation, people were killed in 2018 when they were demanding that election results are released. Where are those people who killed people? They are still holding their jobs. They are still soldiers. They are still in the army. They have not been brought to account. So I think he can't be saying something and walking the other way. The government has to be seen to be making sure that it ensures that all state organs that are charged with performing certain duties or specific duties that are supposed to advance the rule of law in Zimbabwe are doing their job, and they are doing their job without any fear or favor, and that anyone who does something that is contrary to that is held accountable.
Mr. Shivambu, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you so much indeed. Your insights greatly appreciated, and the work that you're doing at Amnesty International. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, and thank you to your viewers.
Thank you. Good night. All right, that's Robert Shivambu from Amnesty International. He's a manager a media manager there, talking to us about the worrying situation in Zimbabwe ahead of the March 26 by-elections, and they're due. But what we've seen is a period of political intolerance in the country aimed at the opposition.